Hello and welcome to my Yu-Gi-Oh channel. Today we're looking at a brand new card which is coming out of Yu-Gi-Oh Animation Chronicles. This is Starving Venemy Dragon. It's a level 7 Dark Attribute Dragon type fusion pendulum monster with 2500 attack and 2000 defense. The pendulum scale is 1, with the pendulum effects being 1 each time a card on the field is sent to the graveyard. Place 1 venemy counter on this card for each. 2. All monsters on the field except Dark Attribute Dragon type monsters lose 200 attack for each venemy counter on the field. And 3. Once per turn you can reduce the battle damage you take from a battle to 0. It requires a Dark Attribute monster and a pendulum monster for its materials to fuse. And the monster effect as well is, you can only use the first monster effect of this card's name once per turn. 1. You can target one face-up monster your opponent controls. Until the end phase, this card's name becomes that monster's original name, and replace this effect with that monster's original effect. Then that monster loses 500 attack and defense, its effects are negated, and if it does, inflict 500 damage to your opponent. And 2. If this card in the monster zone is destroyed, you can place this card in your pendulum zone. So we'll actually cover the individual effects of the pendulum effect first, and then we'll compare with the monster effect as well. The first part of the effect is just placing a venemy counter on this card for each card that's sent from the field to the graveyard. Remember, that's both yours and your opponent's cards, so your opponent has to be very careful of what they're sending, because you're constantly being able to trigger off this effect. I liken this a lot to the Cloudian archetype. They like to put counters on various cards, but I actually prefer it to be on this card specifically, because with the Cloudians, it was very mixed with the archetype. There were certain monsters that had to have the counters on themselves to trigger off their effects. There were other monsters that had effects where it didn't matter so long as there were a certain number of counters. You could remove those counters from anywhere on the field, and then you'd be able to trigger off their effects. Sometimes just isolating the counters is a nice way of actually dealing with this card. There are certain options, of course, which are actually beneficial if it applies to your opponent's monsters. For example, with the Venom archetype, they're based on these Venom counters, and they lose 500 attack for each Venom counter on them, so long as you've got the field spell Venom Swamp on. So you want to be generating those cards and those counters on your opponent's monster cards. So that's where you would have a diversion between Cloudians and the Venom archetype. But for this, and the secondary part of the effect, it works very well with this card. This requires all monsters outside of Dark Dragon monsters to lose 200 attack for each venemy counter. Essentially, the longer the duel goes on, the more likely you are able to pile on those counters. So if you've got 5, that's 1,000 less attack points for each monster your opponent has. You're going to be running a very specific type of deck to actually make use of this, and to make sure that you're not getting blindsided by this effect as well. Whereas chances are your opponent isn't going to be meeting these conditions, and therefore they're going to be losing significant attack points. Just to get over this type of card, they would need, if you've got 5 counters on this, a monster with over 3500 attack. Not the easiest effect to kind of trigger or counter, and it's definitely something that's worthwhile from this secondary effect, and it's facilitated mostly by the first effect as well. The third part of the effect, which I would argue is the weakest part of the pendulum effect, is that once per turn you can reduce the battle damage you take from a battle to 0. Fine, that's okay, it's a nice cherry on the cake type of effect. It's not going to be that useful depending on what situation you're in. If you're on very low life points and you've got other monsters that are weaker, and maybe your opponent is trying to target those to finish you off, yes, that does provide you with that level of protection. But I definitely think there's something they could have substituted with a much better effect. Maybe to stop taking damage for the rest of the turn, or maybe double your damage that you can do to your opponent for one turn by maybe tributing a card. Those are just examples I can give. The summoning requirements for the card are so easy. A Dark monster and a pendulum monster. You're going to be running that type of deck anyway. Yuri from Yu-Gi-Oh! Arc 5 was running that style of deck. So it's definitely something they will very easily be able to meet. In terms of the monster effects, the first one being to target a face-up monster your opponent controls. You're able to replicate and copy the name, to shut down your opponent's monster's effects, and to reduce their attack and defense points by 500, as well as doing 500 points of damage. This is really useful. I liken this a lot to number 8, which is a number monster that was, I think it's called Genome Heritage. It was seen within Yu-Gi-Oh! Zeal, and it was used by Vectrix. The example given in that show was it was against Dextra within the Yu-Gi-Oh! Zeal tournament. And basically what happened is Dextra had made this 3 or 4 card combination where she would have her Photon Papilloperative, it would be able to do damage, it'd be able to stop your opponent from summoning cards onto the field, and then they take a further 1,500 life points of damage, both of them, and he was able to break the cycle by stealing Photon Papilloperative's name and therefore being able to use the effects against her. This is very much the same idea. It stops your opponent's activated effects, which is nice if they've got anything that can disrupt anything. It also reduces their attack and defense. That means you're more likely to be able to get over those cards with this card attacking. And the 500 points of burn damage is a nice cherry on the top effect. The secondary effect, just if this card is destroyed, you can place it in the pendulum zone, which means you can continually recycle the effects. And it means that your opponent isn't going to be able to get rid of this that easily. This is the original card that I was mentioning before. It's called Starving Venom Fusion Dragon, and this is the original card that Yuri used. It's a Dark Attribute Dragon type fusion monster. It's a level 8 with 2,800 attack and 2,000 defense. It requires 2 Dark Attribute monsters on the field to summon it, but they cannot be tokens. And the effect is, if this card is fusion summoned, you can make this card gain attack equal to 1 opponent's special summoned monster until the end of this turn. Once per turn, you can target 1 level 5 or higher monster your opponent controls. Until the end phase, this card's name becomes that monster's original name, and replace this effect with that monster's original effects. If this fusion summon card is destroyed, you can destroy all your opponent's special summoned monsters. So we'll have a quick look at the differences between the cards. Firstly, this one actually seems to gain attack points equal to one of your opponent's special summoned monsters, whereas with the Venemy Dragon, that works on reducing your opponent's attack points steadily over time. The more counters you create, the more attack points they lose. Whereas this just blankly takes one of your opponent's attack points. That's fine as an effect, but sometimes that can actually be a bit of a disadvantage. You might get more of an attack reduction depending on the number of monsters your opponent has and your overall counters versus what this card will gain in attack, which means if you've got multiple monsters, you can do that much more damage. Secondary part is it steals the name and the effects and all of that good stuff, same as Venemy Dragon, but it requires it to be on a level 5 or higher monster. Venemy Dragon doesn't have that restriction to its name, and actually from that point of view, I think that's better. It's more flexible and can target things all the way from level 1 to level 12. This is just very conditional, and there aren't any other reductions, so it doesn't actually reduce the attack points or the defense points, and it doesn't do that nice little bit of burn damage as well. And lastly, this has an explosive effect where it just wipes out all of your opponent's special summon monsters. That's fine depending on what your opponent's running, but I would rather go with Venemy Dragon, which has limited conditions on it and is much more flexible, considering as well it's not just got its monster effects, it's also got the pendulum effects, which makes it a lot more consistent, and it's going to be able to recycle those effects every so often. What do you guys think of these two cards? Do you think the Venemy Dragon is a lot stronger than the Starving Venom Fusion Dragon? Also, I should note this is slightly higher in attack points than Venemy Dragon with 300 additional points. But really, that's not that big of a deal, and if you were to face the two cards off in competition, I think Venemy Dragon would definitely be more popular than this card. Leave whatever comments you have down below, like the video if you enjoyed it, and don't forget to subscribe for more daily Yu-Gi-Oh content.